Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our recurring webinar series. Today we'll be covering Creo tips and tricks. Our short agenda, I'll take about 6 minutes to cover some introductory material and hand things off to our technical lead today, Sean Farringer. A little bit about myself and Sean. I'm the Director of Sales here at ETRAGE. I've been in the PTC space for about 8 years now. I specialize in helping customers identify where and how they can automate and connect their disparate pieces of the digital thread with tools from ETRAGE and tools from PTC. Sean is one of our Creo and manufacturing experts with more than 20 years of experience in the industry. Truly excels at all things Creo NC. But about ETRAGE, we've been in business for more than 20 years. Our mission is to help customers integrate their systems, migrate data as they improve their systems, find ways to automate and extend PLM, make PLM data accessible to all departments and levels of the enterprise. Some examples of our customers. Anyone who's in the design, manufacturing, especially discrete manufacturing space is potentially a good fit with us. Any size of company can be a good fit for what we do. Anyone who needs to share data, find ways to automate, eliminate manual steps and processes, integrate systems that do not currently speak to each other, and find ways to bridge gaps between existing systems that you've inherited and can't do without. Our core offerings on the product side, we provide the ETRAGE Viewer, ETRAGE Document Management System, the plot service for Windchill. And these are all webinars we have done in recent months. So please do look them up if some of these sound like a good fit for yourselves. And on the services side, any number of things connected to Windchill, such as remote support, upgrades between versions, customizations to your workflows and other aspects of Windchill. We provide cloud hosting services for Windchill environments, and we do a great array of training on PTC topics, and that's sort of the theme that we're going with today, a flavor of the type of mentoring and training enablement that we provide with our expert staff. A little bit more about training. We offer any number of formats. Private classes, if you have a large number of students, is the most cost effective, and we'll standardize a curriculum. We'll tailor it to you. That's a set of curriculum materials to get to keep and use and refer back to after the class is done. We do offer public classes that we only have 1 or 2 students. They can still be cost effective. We offer e-learning, which is something you can do self-paced. It really is an excellent way to have long-term reinforcement and long-term reference. You can assign an e-learning license to individual users, and you can even embed your own models and practices into e-learning curriculum. And of course, customized mentoring as well. Today, in just a moment, Sean will take over sharing his screen, but 4 general topics, and we'll go as long as we need to cover assembly and combined states. We'll replace unrelated parts. We'll cover making of a new map key and recover naming outside of Creo. And again, we'll address any questions that come in. There is a little tab on the webinar interface where you can submit questions. If time allows, we will address those live on the fly. If time does not, then we'll reach out to you with Sean and myself to answer any questions that come in. With that, I'll hand things over to Sean, and thank you again for joining us, everyone.
Okay, we should have screen sharing and visibility here. I'm sure Scott will let me know if there are problems with the audio or the visual as we kind of move forward. As Scott mentioned today, we're going to have 4 topics in our webinar, loose topics, if you will. Time permitting, if I can knock through these and kind of stay on our timeline agenda, I'll maybe throw in another topic at the end, and we'll see about maybe working on cleaning up this horrifying surface on this cover that has been left on our drill. So we'll see how time goes. We're going to hit our 4 core topics, and then maybe we'll get into a little bit of surfacing here on this object as well, and kind of do something less hideous as that. But the first thing we want to talk about today, that I really think, there's, most of the people I engage with aren't taking advantage of this functionality. If you really start to embrace it and you have any depth of assembly in what you do, this can really, bring to bear some quick and easy, some quick and easy productivity enhancements for Creo. So let's take a look at combined states. Now, what are combined states? We see down here in the bottom of my screen, I've got this default all tab sitting down here. And most everybody's probably got something like that, assuming that they've set up their scenario to display combined views. So we access this through the View Manager available in the Graphics toolbar, as well as on our primary ribbon tab inside of assembly mode. So now here we have where we see that we can activate and maintain the display of combined states out here on the bottom of the screen. That's probably going to be our first step, in terms of taking advantage of this functionality. But once we can access these tabs, chances are workflows that we're already using and things we're already doing can be captured in a very elegant way and utilized very quickly in combined states. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So as a for instance, just using this assembly, I might want to drill down and have a scenario where I'm only looking at like the internal rotating assembly of the engine for the drill. Now, there's a lot of pick and hide, an enormous amount of pick and hide to do here. And the problem with hiding objects is that if I select an object, and like in this case, the air filter cover makes a good example, it's down inside of our carburetor here, and I hide this object inside of my assembly, well, then I have to go find it in the model tree. And that's really annoying in a large assembly because it might not be obvious where everything is explicitly located that you may have graphically selected and hidden and things to that effect. Now, when we talk about the visibility of objects, the cool kids are all using simplified reps instead of things like layer configurations where they put parts on a layer and stuff to that effect. This example contains a little bit of that. I can turn off these bolts because they've all been put on a layer, but that's not really the cool stuff because we don't gain the benefit of the math by only turning things off with hide. So a part of what we're going to get here in the use of combined states is the strength of simplified reps, as well as some apparent state visuals that I'll show as well. So the first thing we might want to do is make a new simplified rep that drills down to the internals so we can hide show that stuff. So we'll go ahead and make rep 01 to kind of drill down and get to our internals only. So I'm going to go ahead and turn everything on the assembly. So everything's in master rep now. So now here with all that in master rep, I'm going to remove the selection of internal. I'm going to remove the internal components from selection. So that rotating assembly that I'm looking for should, be what is not selected right now. So then I'm going to set representation to exclude on everything else. And there's my rotating assembly. So I can say apply, and then we can go ahead and open that. Now we have a simple rep for that. And of course, we can go back and dial in the simple rep a little bit and say, hey, I've got a couple of bolts that didn't come through on there. I want to go do a select in the main window now inside of the simple rep interface. And I'm just going to go pick off, whoops, I got to get on my control key. There we go. I'm going to go pick off all these bolts here. And we'll go ahead and we'll turn those off too. So we'll set those to be excluded. So there we go. So now we've got our internal rotating assembly. And I might want to look at this in a specific view typically. So I'm going to capture it kind of like right there. That's going to be my view that I want to primarily focus on for the rotating assembly. So I'll go ahead and make a new view now real quick. So we'll go ahead and we'll just say internal for this view. Okay. And we'll go ahead and we'll save this. So now we've gone ahead, we've made, a view state that we like, as well as a simplified rep. Now this is where combined states that are accessible on our all tab inside of the view manager, this is where everything starts to come together. So let's make a new combined state here, and we'll just call this internal. We'll We'll follow some reasonably decent naming convention today. When you're prompted with this statement of reference originals or create copies, I'm always saying reference the original, because then if you make changes to the original simple app or the original thing, you get the behavior that you expect. So now we've got an internal combined state that we can subsequently right click on and say edit definition. So we're going to go to the orientation internal that I created. We'll take that repo 1 that I created as far as that goes. We can turn on and off the visibility of annotations. We have a lot of things that can be applied here. We're going to start talking about appearance here in a second, because I'm going to show that in another kind of iteration of this thing, that we can kind of make some changes to appearance and bring that in on our combined state as well. So we'll go ahead and say okay, and we'll say close. So now down here, we've got a default all that lets us click the button and have the whole drill. And at just the click of a button, I can have my view orientation as well as my internal rotating assembly presented on the screen in isolation. And I don't have a whole bunch of hide show. I don't have to find a million things in the model tree. I don't have to build layers and screw around with turning on and off layers and going on and back and forth to the layer tab and all of that drama. I can just activate this combined state right down here, and then there I am ready to go. The cool part about this, most significantly for those doing very large assemblies or assemblies that rise to the level of actually pressuring your computer in some way, is once I've done this, because I used a simp rep, I can come up here and I can do an erase not display, and I can blow all that stuff out of memory that I've taken away visually. And that's why we prefer, or we advise nowadays to be using simple reps for the display of components and things like that, as opposed to using hide show, because hide show doesn't really bring it to a level where you can subsequently, take away the math, if you will. So now I can go back to default all, and you'll see there was a slight hesitation there while I brought all those objects back into session memory. And now here we are ready to go again. And I can simply switch around on these things. But one of the other things that we need to bring into our, we need to bring to bear, or we should, because it would be cool here with respect to our combined state, is to add some other things to it. So a combined state collects a whole bunch of information. Let's bring a style state to bear on this, and let's call this internal as well. And then let's go ahead and go to show, and let's pull transparent on that clutch housing right there, so we can kind of see through that at the end of the day. And we'll go ahead and say okay and say close. Now let's do another cool thing here that is really kind of nice, and it's one of my favorite things in some of the more recent versions of Creo, is we now have appearance states as well. So let's go ahead and make a new appearance state. Let's call this internal also. And now we'll go ahead, and we've got this internal appearance state activated. So I'm going to go get my box of crayons, and we'll get something transparent looking here, and we'll make the piston, or nope, that wasn't a transparent color. What's that? Yeah, we'll go with this. There we go. So now we've got this issue transparent by style state, and we've got this issue transparent by appearance. Those are a little bit different. We've only changed the color of this object inside of the context of the assembly, not in the context of everything, if you will. So now we've got those things created. Now we go back to our all and go ahead and edit definition on our combined state again. Now we'll use the internal combined state, and we'll go ahead and use the internal appearance state also. So now we're going to get all of these things for our button. So there's the whole assembly. And now I've got my nice, elegant internal state displayed that is combining a simplified rep, an appearance state, as well as a style state all at the same time, to give me the best visuals, to work from when I'm just working on the rotating assembly inside. And now, not only that, but I have nice, easy to access buttons on the bottom of my screen, so I can work back and forth between that and the whole assembly, if you will, the whole big thing. So that's a nice dive into some of the benefits and the walkthroughs of just using combined states on a typical assembly. So next up, let's have a look at replace unrelated. So a lot of people have to replace parts, and a lot of times they aren't on a family table or something cool where they're interrelated to Creo in some way. So we'll take, for instance, this bolt right here. So I've got, these 5 bolts here, or 4 bolts here, excuse me, that are holding that front cover on. They're 5 millimeter. Let's go, do something. Because we can't. So we're going to go ahead and say we want to replace an unrelated component in this case. Now, the order of this workflow is somewhat significant. It is important that you dictate unrelated component first. Always remember to not remember these components. That checkbox doesn't do you any favors. I could explain that for the rest of our webinar today, but I'm going to trust that everybody may understand why I'm making that statement. And if not, just trust me if you can. Remembering the components isn't typically a good idea, especially for those inside of Windchill. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and open up an object, and we'll go ahead and get something from the library here to put in there. So let's go get a screw. We'll get a socket head cap screw, and we'll go find this. This is like a McMaster library. So we'll get a 1/4 inch, and we'll get, I don't know, we'll get 875s today because we can. All right, so we're going to go ahead and open that. Now, we've said that we want to replace those components with this component, and they aren't associated in any way. I literally browsed for some other new thing. Now is the moment where you go click Edit Ref Table, and it will only be enabled when you use this workflow of steps. First thing is unrelated component. Go find the component, come back, edit the ref table. Now we come into the ref table. When we say edit ref table, basically what PTC is doing is creating an interchange table on the fly for you and putting it on the screen and making things elegant and easy to deal with at that moment. So first thing we would do is click evaluate, because you may get lucky and things may line up by names or IDs. If somebody did a horrifying thing like save as copy or something to that effect, you would line up quite a bit of this with that. So it's always paying to click evaluate first. These components couldn't be more unrelated in this case. So I'm not finding anything in terms of evaluate, and I'm going to have to take on this reference selection myself. So when this tagline is highlighted, it's showing you the reference on the component you're replacing, and you simply need to pick the equivalent reference on your new component. So we're going to pick that cylindrical surface for that. And of course, this is the surface underneath the socket cap screw head. So we're going to pick that for our second reference. So now we've got those picked, and we've transferred those two references onto our new object, and we say okay, and we say okay. And now we can regen this thing. We can see the distinction in the difference in the screws here. Now we could regen this thing, and everything is fine. It replaced those parts without drama, even though they don't have any underlying PTC association. They're not family table, they're not merged, they're not inherited, there's nothing going on there. And that still brought it into the assembly quite elegantly and let me replace those. And it wasn't a bunch of drama. And they're not really, assembled by, they're not patterned, obviously, in this case or anything to that effect. So it really works well to get through some of that stuff in order to, replace things quickly and get things mapped onto new and unrelated parts. So next up on today's agenda for discussions would be making a map. So we access map keys. PTC buried this after a while. It used to be more front facing, if you will, but now we have to go to File Options Environment. It's File Options Environment to access the map keys. Okay. And then here we define, run, and manage map keys. So we'll go ahead and say we're going to go ahead and create a map key, and we can make map keys to do pretty much anything. Whoops, I didn't want that to go behind. I'll have to re-access it. That was unfortunate. There we go. Yeah, so we want to keep enough of this to select over there. All right, so we can make map keys for pretty much any sequence of events inside of Creo. When you record a map key, it pays to use sanity and don't make a bunch of extra clicks and don't click around and do a bunch of weird stuff and things like that, because all of that stuff is actually being recorded. So we want to have a clean map key, if you will. So we'll just make a map key today that does something simple like, sets up the front view. Sometimes you want to map the front view to a mouse button or a space mouse button or something like that. So we'll just make a map key that does a front view. So we're going to go ahead and make a new map key today. And I like to try and use sanity for these things. So I'll just say FV today. For front view. Okay. I have one of these that I use personally. It's already FF. So we got to make a new one that's similar, and we'll call this front view. All right, so we've got front view, and then we're going to go ahead and record keyboard input. All right, so we'll go ahead and record. So once we start recording, now everything we click and do interacting with Creo is going to be recorded from this point on until I click stop. So if I'm looking for this to set up a nice front view for me, we're going to go ahead and go access the save view orientations, and I'll go to front view, and then I'll zoom this in a little bit. Okay, we'll zoom it to about that level right there, and then we'll go ahead and say stop, and we'll say okay. So now we made a map key, and we have this FV map key right here, front view, that we just made. And typically what we would want to do is save the changed map keys. And this saves out to a config.pro file. And I encourage everybody to just put this on your desktop when you save this file out, so it doesn't conflict with wherever directory or thing that you might be in. So we'll go ahead and say okay. Now I'll go to my desktop real quick, and we'll open up this config.pro here. Get that back over. All right, so here we are with the config.pro, and we see just this map key that was recorded here. Now, I would copy and paste this map key into my master config.pro so that the map key was available and loaded every time I started Creo. Some people have like a map keys file where they store all the map keys, and then they load that separately. Nothing wrong with that. However you would want to go and do that, you can. But that's kind of how I go about it. And then, you know, and I have just this map key organized nice and tightly. So when I put it in the master file, it's easy to kind of, you know, I can kind of see that and, you know that it's all that group of content is associated with that particular map key. How you would fire that map key off. It's a webinar, so you can't see me push the buttons, but I'm going to click front view, FV, as I just did. And here we are in the front view, and it plays back the recording of that front view, or excuse me, the accessing of that front view is played back for me. So that's just making quick map key and utilizing it so that, you know, you can do stuff. It can be far more complex than that. When it is, I encourage you to write out the map key so it's not like figuring it out and you know all the clicks and you know all the picks as you go through it. And then, you know, you'll have a good map key that'll be, you know, elegant and very durable. If you record a bunch of nonsense into your map keys, they do not port well between versions. So I have map keys that I've literally been carrying through versions of Creo that are fairly complex at the end of the day, that I have utilized for well over 10 years, 10 to 15 years, and the map keys still work today just like they did then, but I took some time to make sure they were recorded sanely. Okay, so one of the last things I wanted to mention in our webinar today, if we don't dive into some surfacing real quick, would be the idea of renaming outside of Creo and how we recover that with some sanity. Invariably, people that don't work inside, and I'm just going to throw that assembly away and ditch all of its changes, erase not displayed. Invariably, I'll close my map keys. Invariably, sooner or later, somebody comes along and does something that we all hate. If you don't have wind chill, somebody will come along and rename a file in Windows like I'm doing right now. So they're going to come in here, they're going to use Windows or whatever because they think they're in some other product that lets you do this. And Creo is pretty rigid this way. I mean, it expects to find the things it expects. Now, you know, these issues that I'm working through and kind of demonstrating, if you work in a wind chill environment, it's not likely, you know, you encounter these things unless maybe you're working in a wind chill environment, but you're doing a big project lift locally, and then you're uploading, you know, core project content from your local computer later or something to that effect. Then you might also encounter this. But wind chill should arguably protect people from, you know, these kind of unfortunate things happening. And unfortunately, there are no magic bullets, and these things do still happen. So we're going to rename that to XYZ crank today. So I just took one of the sub-assemblies that's necessary for our drill that we've been looking at, and I renamed that formally in Windows. So let's go break it. So now we'll go ahead, and here's an example of a map key that's fairly elaborate. Goes through the process of setting a working directory and then prompting me to open a file so I can get things opening on my screen quickly. So here we are with broken stuff. So as we mentioned, we went and renamed this crank assembly thing, and, you know, now it's all blown up. And we can go down here to our regeneration manager, and we see we've got a missing model. And that's like the first problem. Okay, we got, you know, regeneration failed here, you know, the drill, blah, blah, blah. And we have a missing model. And that's usually a place where we're going to start having problems in a case like this regen issue. So I click on that. That takes me right to the thing that's grumpy about. There it's looking for that crank assembly that we all know that I just renamed outside in Windows. And that's a problem because when I say retrieve component, PTC now shows me the component that I want. You know, we can see it now. It used to filter everything and you couldn't see any objects at all, if you will, in this dialog if they did not have the specific name that PTC was looking for. But now we can see, yes, okay, the XYZ crank does appear to be this thing I want, but I'm going to be told to kick rocks. Selected model does not match the missing model. So we're not going to get to do that. You know, I can't just do, you know, I can't just replace this here now. PTC is not going to let this happen. I can't retrieve this missing model this way. Now I could go do a replace unrelated and all that stuff in you know, kind of as we previously kind of covered, and then it should arguably map in exceptionally well for, you know, that kind of thing. But ultimately, we may have this shared across assemblies. This may be a shared component. It may need XYZ crank for the name now, but this assembly is broken to that. So the way we get around that without breaking potentially other associated parts that may be looking for XYZ crank assembly now, instead of just this drill, is we're going to go ahead and open up XYZ crank assembly now. So we're going to go ahead and open this up by itself. So here it is in isolation. And of course it has the XYZ crank name. Well, this, we go file, prepare, rename, or excuse me, file, manage, rename, pardon me, file, manage, rename. So here when we get to rename, everybody just comes in here, types in new names and clicks OK. Well, the thing is you have a little bit of flexibility and strength with this dialog that you can take advantage of in these conditions. So what we're going to do is we're going to rename in session only. And we know that the assembly that I have open right now behind me that's failing wants the crank. It doesn't want XYZ crank. It wants crank. So I'm going to rename it to crank. But I'm only doing this in session. And I say, OK. Now, when this comes up, I'm going to uncheck use the suffix here. And we see that we've got, you know, it's going to get a new name for crank, but I'm going to keep the names on the crankshaft and flywheel, of course. So we'll go ahead and we'll say, OK. So now we have a crank assembly and it's been renamed, but only in session. So now we're going to jump back to the drill assembly and we're going to regenerate this thing. So we'll click regenerate. We'll regenerate a couple times. All of our failures go away. And this is why when we start with a failing assembly that we open up and there's a whole bunch of crap that's all blown up and it's scatter shot, if you see missing components, go there first. Get the missing component issues resolved and see if that doesn't build out the rest of the assembly like we've seen in this case. That's a good place to start. It's not guaranteed that they'll solve all the failures of a blown up assembly that you happen to be the unfortunate recipient of, but it's definitely the place that I recommend everybody start, because as we see here, this is a really good example. You know, everything that was wrong because that component was missing. Now we have crank assembly in this assembly, but the key is now we don't save anything yet in this assembly. So we just switch back again to our crank assembly. And now we're going to do the same thing again. We're going to manage file. We're going to do a rename. We're going to rename this in session. And we're going to say it's XYZ crank, because we know that existed, you know, that we could have retrieved that part to begin with. So we just need to rename it in session. We say, OK. Now it knows that, hey, wait a minute, you know, there is one of those out there on the disk right now. So are you sure you want to do this? Yes, because we want everything to go back to working. So we say, OK. And now we'll uncheck the use suffix again. We notice that it is keeping the names. It's giving me another new name again of XYZ crank. We say, OK. We go back to our assembly and we regen this thing. Whoops. We regen the assembly. Now we have the new name. It's in session. Now I can save this assembly, and any objects that are also referring to XYZ crank now are not broken. Everybody's happy. All of the objects in case in point will be recoverable. Not only this assembly, but something else that might now be looking for XYZ crank instead of looking for, excuse me, looking for crank assembly by itself. So that's a little bit of how we go about dealing with the renaming of stuff and things to that effect when we want to transfer something over to a new name. So I'm going to go ahead and blow all these things out of memory here real quick. And I'll go back and put the name back as expected because I didn't save anything. And now, of course, you know, we can go ahead and retrieve that assembly as expected now, just like before, because I took the name back to what it was. prior to doing that. If I had saved that assembly while it was XYZ crank, I would have saved out and effectively completed that process with XYZ crank than having been the new object that the assembly wanted to retrieve. So Scott got a couple of minutes in the beginning, so I'll take a couple of minutes here on the end, and we'll go ahead and open this filter up real quick, and we'll talk about control points. That really wasn't on the agenda, but we'll go through it real quick because this thing is just horrifying to look at, if nothing else. So we're going to go ahead, and this is that surface in question where they're building that out. So I'm going to go ahead and do an insert here, and then we'll show only that object. So there's that surface in question, and let's turn on, there we go. I'm going to have to turn on all the construction stuff here. Let's unhide all those goodies, and let's hide this. Why are my constructions not turning on there? There we go. All right. So we see here that I'll turn this back on. The surface is quite horrifying. I mean, this looks terrible in terms of surface quality in this example. So one of the things that when we make boundary blends, when you don't utilize a key piece of functionality in it, you end up with stuff that looks like this because all of the inputs have knots in them. These are separate pieces of sketch or thing or whatever. So it can be really unfortunate. These don't have the same number of pieces. There's knots and things and stuff like that. So the way we go about this is when we're making or dealing with our boundary blends, we go ahead and make sure that we get our stuff dialed in right. So I'm going to go ahead and put a boundary blend together here. So I'm just holding my control key, selecting those three curves. I'm going to go ahead and jump into the second direction curves now, and I'm going to build those out real quick. And you're going to see as I'm doing this, it's horrifying, just like the first one was, or like the previous example that I brought up. So we see in the preview, it's an equally horrifying surface to what I've taken issue with and that we're going to go fix here. So when we want to do this, we take advantage of control points in here. And you have control points in the first and second direction respectively. Now, in this case, the second direction, which is the horizontal mapping, are the curves that are giving me the greatest grief, because the horizontal mapping defines what is in our case the vertical surface UV lines that we see here. So we're going to go ahead and select our first control point up here at the top, and we'll pick one up there, and we're just going to pick what the point is all the way down along that line. And then we're just going to keep doing that all the way down the surface through these curves that are part of boundary blend. So now we're going to pick these down along, and you're just using sanity and lining them up as you go. And we're picking them all kind of in the same scope here. Whoops, there we go. I missed that one. And there we got that one. So now we can see the surface UV map looks fairly respectable. Maybe not arguably, to everybody's standard, but nonetheless, when we compare it to the previous, I'm turning off all the construction curves and geometry again. So if we look at this, we say that is what it is. That's pretty hideous. And then we come back and whoops, we got to turn that one off. And we come back and we look at the other one. Yes, that's far and away improved. So the final sneak in tip and trick to take back a little bit of my time from Scott, if you will, to kind of keep in context with our half-hour time frame, if you will, or very close to that. This would be, the use of control points, because as we see here, it's a substantial difference. I mean, that surface is awful compared to the quality. Whoops, I keep doing that. Compared to the quality of the second surface that we created here. So that's a kind of, functionality that you could get from control points, and that, will definitely improve this stuff. Now, in this case, I could have gone in and subsequently also, done control points on the first direction here, if you will, so we could come through and put control points on the first direction, but I'm not going to get the same level of, feedback quality from the first direction that I got from the second direction in this case, because the only thing I would clear out in the first direction is this double split right here, if you will, that comes around. Everything else is running on a single seam already. So if we went in and did the first direction, we could clear this little part of the thing up right here along the way. And that would be the improvement we would get from the first direction. So with that, we've covered those 4 core topics that we discussed, and we snuck in another little bit of a thing about control points to fix up the surface on our drill, because that's just a lot better to look at. I'm sorry. I don't have all the rest of the features in the build turned on. That surface is just awful, that is used in that example. So with that, I want to cleave out at least a little bit of time for any quick question and answer that we might have. And beyond that, then I'll let everybody get off to their lunch and their day.
Thank you very much, Sean. And if anybody has questions, you'll find there's a little question icon, the Q&A tab. You can type those in there. I don't see that any have come through yet. So if we don't have anything in the next 10 seconds here, I'll just take over the screen share and leave contact information up on the screen as we wrap up the recording. Thanks again, everyone, for attending. Thanks again, all. We're going to go ahead and stop the recording. We'll see you on the next one.